Hi everybody, and welcome to the next lesson for U.S. History 11. This is all about the Gilded Age. We've learned about the Reconstruction era, and we've talked about how the businessman became very powerful in the Reconstruction era because he was trying to help us rebuild the government. And by rebuilding, we don't just mean putting the nation back together. We also mean rebuilding roads, infrastructure, creating jobs for people so that they can get their lives back together. However, in this era, the government is not very interested in regulating or controlling anything that the businessmen tend to do. Some of those businessmen don't have the best interest of the workers in mind, so to speak. So I like this cartoon, this political cartoon here, because it shows very well what it was like to be a laborer in the Gilded Age and how bad things were for them. And so we have your wealthy businessmen here up top, on top of this barge, I think it is. And then we have all of these workers on the bottom holding them up. And oh my goodness, you see all these products here. You have linens, you have shovels here that are used, and all types of bagged goods here. And we have all these wealthy men clutching their money bags. And so this cartoon just really expresses so well what the Gilded Age was like for workers and what it was like for wealthy businessmen. They're having a great time up here, and the working man is really struggling. So let's get into it. Let's talk about our learning tasks for the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age encompasses many presidents. We like to collectively call these presidents the Forgettable Presidents. These are many presidents between 1877 and 1900. There are several of them. Most of them were Republican presidents, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, who was president twice, with a president in between. He's our only Democratic president. So here are our learning tasks. We're going to learn all about businessmen being in control and influencing the government and what that meant. We're going to learn about minorities, farmers, and laborers struggling again. And we're going to learn all about how the reform period will start after this, called the Progressive Era. So let's begin to talk in a little more detail. So we have here businessmen in control. There are all kinds of things that we can look at, it's all kinds of evidence in the historical record to prove to us that businessmen are in control, that they're very influential at this time. And so I'm just going to briefly talk through a few of these. Later on you'll be able to look at them in more detail. So these go chronologically. We have some court cases here. Wabash versus Illinois. This is a court case in which the railroad is being challenged, and basically what people are trying to do is get control of the railroads, which are price gouging people. And unfortunately this case doesn't turn out to be very in support of the people. That in fact ends up supporting the railroads. We have then, because of the fact that this case decided for the railroad owners and not for the people in helping control the power of the railroads, we have something called the Interstate Commerce Act that comes from this, where the U.S. government says, look, railroads travel between states according to the Constitution. We can control that travel between states, and so we are going to begin to assert our power over the railroads through the Interstate Commerce Act. So one of the first times the U.S. government ever did such a thing. And so this is going to really kind of get people thinking about the power of the government to regulate and control the big businessman. The Gospel of Wealth is a piece of writing written by Andrew Carnegie, in which he basically tells the world, you know, this is how I became wealthy, this is how you can become wealthy. And this is one of the characteristics of the Gilded Age, is how wealthy businessmen wanted to convince people that if they just did a certain number of things, they too could become wealthy. And once again, it's another example of the power and the influence of the wealthy businessmen. There's a Congress that spends so much money. It's called the $1 billion Congress during this time. There'll be an antitrust act that's going to show up to try and put pressure and control some of the businesses, the monopolies who have gathered together to engage in price controls, product controls. The McKinley tariff will be a high tariff, a tax on imports to protect the businessman and to give him the power to sell his goods at home. And then we're going to get into some silver purchase acts. And the reason for this is that the U.S. government is, because of this billion-dollar Congress, it needs some money. The Treasury is empty, and they begin to purchase silver. And then finally, they have to even take out a loan from one of the wealthiest businessmen in the United States at the time, the banker J.P. Morgan, who loans the U.S. government $65 million to keep the Treasury from emptying and the country from going bankrupt. Businessmen are so powerful at this time they even stage a revolution in Hawaii, throw the Queen out of power, and take over. And then finally, we have a case, which is almost unbelievable, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a company that owned 99% of sugar production was not a monopoly. So from all those things, you can see businessmen, they're really powerful. They've got several parts of the government that are supporting them. They're very influential. So like I said, if you were a minority, a farmer, a laborer, it was not a good time for you. In fact, Native Americans are going to have a new act passed and that will say that, we need to give them 160 acres. We're going to move them off the reservations. And in conjunction with this, we're going to try to take their children and send them to school and teach them to live in the American way, have them speak English and no longer speak their native languages, to give up their native dress. You couldn't have a Native American name. One of the problems with the Dawes Act is they settled some of these Native Americans on land that would not grow food. It didn't have a water supply, so they basically couldn't live on it. Compromise of 1877 is the official compromise that ended the election of 1876, in which there was an issue, and it also ended the Reconstruction era. So I just kind of put that in there so that everyone would know, even though the country wasn't fully reconstructed, we were done with that as a goal. Plessy versus Ferguson is a controversial Supreme Court case which overturned the Civil Rights Act and basically said that separate but equal facilities were illegal, and most of the time they were separate, but they were definitely not equal. We're going to live with this ruling for several years up into the 1950s. Labor is beginning to organize, and they're getting tired of being pushed around by the businessmen. They're tired of not having good working conditions. They're tired of having low wages and not being able to have enough money to feed their families. One of the most influential strikes at this time is the Pullman strike, in which you have several railroads will pull together and they will strike and lead a nationwide railroad strike, stop the trains, put pressure on the government. And eventually, what comes out of this, unfortunately, is the U.S. government will call out troops to try to break the strike, and they do break the strike. But one of the benefits of this strike is the U.S. government finally decided to give labor some recognition, and they created Labor Day. The American Federation of Labor is one of the very first labor unions after the Knights of Labor, which was the first one of the other ones as well. And the American Federation of Labor is very successful because it takes different labor groups and divides them up into sections where they can advocate for things that they needed. Whereas the Knights of Labor down here, they just threw everybody in the same labor union, and it was real hard for the labor unions to make any progress because you can't get benefits for steel workers and textile workers. Sometimes it's hard to get everybody's needs recognized, and so the American Federation of Labor, which actually comes after the Knights of Labor, I should put it down here, it will do that. It will separate the labor groups and let those labor groups call for benefits that specifically benefit them most. African Americans are beginning to organize. They're beginning to ask for more and more of their political rights. There will be a meeting in Niagara, and this will be one of the times that African American leaders like W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington will come together, and they will try to decide, what are we fighting for? And eventually this will result in the Atlanta Compromise, in which they will agree to fight for promoting the top 10% of African Americans, and also promoting education and work opportunities. Also during this time, we have a presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. He will make something called the Cross of Gold speech during his campaign, in which he will advocate for the U.S. government to allow free coinage of silver, which is something that had previously occurred with the Bland-Allison Act. And the reason that this is important is that gold is in short supply because it's mostly controlled by the wealthy businessmen and the wealthy class. Silver is the coinage or the type of money that is used by the labor class and the farmers. And so they wanted the U.S. government to coin more of it so there would be more in circulation. And he, through this speech, calls for that. And he is, unfortunately, he doesn't get elected, but eventually there will be some of his voice will be heard as we head toward the progressive era. As I said, a rough time to be a minority. The Chinese Exclusion Act will exclude the Chinese from coming into the country. They had been a big labor force in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. However, their labor is no longer needed, and we will begin to exclude them. The Knights of Labor, as I spoke before, this is another labor union. They'll be advocating for specific benefits such as better working conditions, better wages. Wages had been cut during this time due to the Panic of 1873, and they will create a demonstration in Haymarket, Chicago, and what will end up happening is there will be a bomb thrown at this demonstration. There will be some policemen killed. There will be some people killed and hurt. And because of this incident, it's called the Haymarket Riot, the Knights of Labor will essentially go away. We'll learn about this Haymarket Riot a little more later. The American Protective Association is another association that's created at this time in which people will basically, in this organization, say that people who are born in America are the only people who should get the best jobs. We want to make sure that we protect those jobs for native-born Americans. And then the Homestead Strike is one of the other strikes in this era at a Carnegie steel plant that is very violent, and it shows the links that the government will combine with a businessman to basically shut down the labor movement. And then at the end of this era, we're going to see the beginnings of reform due to some of these violent strikes, due to some of the political issues that come forward, due to the fact that the businessman is getting so powerful. Some people will begin to ask for reforms, and this will be precipitated by the assassination of one of our presidents, James A. Garfield. You're going to learn a little bit more about this. We'll have one of the first reform laws passed called the Pendleton Act, and this is a civil service reform in which a person has to take a test to get a job in the government. You can't just give it to somebody who supported you. And it will end the old spoils system started by Andrew Jackson many, many years ago, in which he just basically gave jobs to people who supported him, regardless of whether or not they had the skills to do the job. And then finally, a new political party will begin to develop a lot of beliefs and ideas for changing our nation and supporting labor, and that is the Populist Party platform. And they will call for income taxes, they will call for benefits for labor, and many, many reforms. They will begin in 1892. They will not be very successful, but a lot of the reforms that they call for will be embraced by another party called the Progressive Era, and also some of our major political parties will take on those reforms. So that is the end of this lesson. I hope you learned a little bit about these tasks, how reform came from this time, minorities, farmers, and laborers having such a hard time, businessmen being in control, and being affected by the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is called the Gilded Age because it seemed like a great time, and it was a great time if you were one of these guys. Covered in gold, that's what gilded means. But really, underneath the surface of this great time were all these people struggling and having a really difficult time. So again, I'll see you in the next lesson, and thank you so much.